This time, what we're going to be looking at is the narrative project, particularly how there might be a more powerful way of talking about poverty than the narrative project seems to want to encourage people to do. You'll be hearing from myself. I'm Martin Kirk. I'm the head of strategy for the rules, previously of Oxfam, and then before that, Save the Children. And my colleague Joe Brewer, who does a lot of the research for us at the rules. So what we thought we would do is, and it's going to slip straight onto a slide, into a screen share now. We've got a little PowerPoint to help us here. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk a little bit about the intervention that we've made so far and the reactions to it, and then we're going to, what we really want to do is focus this morning on the alternative, the solutions. We don't want to just talk about the negative and the critique, we want to focus on the solutions. But just to remind people, we sent a letter to all CEOs and directors of comms and campaigns of all the big participating agencies, plus other big players in the development space, asking them to take a moment to reconsider some of their attachment to the basic element of the narrative project as we saw it, which was to centralize ODA and its sister logic, charity, in the poverty discourse in the next period. We thought that was a profoundly problematic thing and depoliticized and limited the amount by which we could be able to engage the public. We've had some good reactions from people, some really encouraging reactions from some people. Well, put it this way, there are essentially three types of reactions we've had. One is that people agree with the basic critique we're making, but have been put off by the style with which we've made it. They thought we were a little bit overly aggressive, going straight into kind of the public sphere with it, which is an understandable critique. There are people who are just generally upbeat and, yes, very glad somebody's saying this, because it is difficult sometimes for individuals to mount this sort of, but certainly very robust, direct challenge from where they are, because everyone's got careers to worry about, and there are big power players in the crosshairs here, and it's not always easy or possible for people to mount critiques at this scale. So basically, just agreed with us and glad somebody's saying it. And thirdly, there was a group of people who said we're kind of doing this already. There's nothing really to worry about. Although from our perspective, all the evidence would suggest that. Although in some campaigns and policy communications, certainly some positive stuff is happening and has been for many years. It's not new, but when you look at across the entirety of communications, particularly from NGOs, when you wrap in the fundraising and all the trading of the shops and stuff, it's very clear that the majority of communications still is very much in the charity frame. And so we would disagree with that last reaction, the profound point, but that's fine. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk through a few slides here. We would really appreciate it if people, what we want to do, we want to spend as much time as possible on discussion and debate this time. So we will be talking for maybe 25 minutes, and then what we'd really like is to get some input from you guys. So there's a Q&A box. As questions come up, just fire them off. I'll be tracking those, and we'll either ask them as we go along, or we'll wait towards the end and ask them at the end. But that's what we'd really like to happen. We want this to be a really interactive process. Okay, so I'm just about to hand over to Joe. He's going to take you through a few slides, and I will be tracking the Q&A. Okay, Joe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martin. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. My name's Joe Brewer. I'm in Seattle, Washington in the United States, and I've been helping the rules for quite some time with the linguistic analysis, looking at all of these semantic frames. And what I really want to talk with you all about today is how the core issue that we have, kind of the critique we brought against the Gates Foundation's narrative project as an exemplar of a larger phenomenon, is that really, it's something that we observed in the Finding Frames report that came out 4 years ago, that when we looked at the structure of the global conversation around poverty, international development, that most of the narrative was structured to focus on charitable giving and aid. And we saw this as being problematic in a number of ways. And so, as the slide that Martin has just put up shows, if that's displaying properly for you, basically what we see as the really core issue is that this macro scale narrative about rich countries offering aid and support to poorer countries, that there is a general structure to that entire conversation that really cannot help but evoke what we call the moral order frame, which is basically the presumption that one side is superior or privileged and the other side is inferior and marginalized. And that any time that the conversation is about charity or aid, that this moral order just cannot help but come up. And so this is something we think is really a power dynamic and a kind of patronizing or marginalizing type of structure that really keeps us from working collaboratively across the different parts of the world. Even if our individual values and interests are focused elsewhere, we really, for those of us who would really like to see a more inclusive and empowering collaborative discourse, that every time we talk about charity and aid, the structure of the conversation itself keeps that from happening. And one of the things that we found it to be really maybe a more subtle point that we'd like to clarify and draw out a little bit more now. And Martin, just so you know, I'm actually seeing your email inbox now.
Oh yeah, sorry. And my screen share went wrong there. Let me.
But I'll just continue chatting, and if people haven't gotten to see those bullets, then they'll at least be there to review later in the recorded version of this presentation. But one of the things that is really important about charity and aid is the way that the conversation is structured. It actually focuses on the locus of action. And the locus of action for charitable giving is from the giver. If we're talking about charity, we're talking about someone who gives and then someone who receives. And with the focus generally on the giver, the receiver is kind of defaulted into a silent or passive position. So this reinforces the idea that the various stereotypes, which tend to be very racist stereotypes, the poor black children of the global south or of Africa are just silent, passive recipients of the active do-gooders from the west or the north. This is part of the structure of that conversation, and it reinforces a lot of unfortunate and problematic relationships. But even more than that, when we step outside of the narrative structure of charity and aid itself, and we start looking at what happens when we're talking about aid, is that a very important thing about frame semantics that comes out of neuroscience is that anytime that the human brain is activating a certain perspective or a certain mental model, it is also at the same time suppressing or not activating an alternative perspective. A simple way that I like to say this is when you're thinking about a rake, as a garden tool, you're not simultaneously thinking about a hose. So when you think about a rake, the image of a rake comes up, and any image of a hose would fall to the background. In the same way, when we're talking about charity and aid, the barriers to ending poverty and the structural causes of poverty that all of our different NGO research has shown to exist. So this is tax havens, trade agreements, tax structures, etc., and so on. All of these structural issues, all of those things are pushed to the background. And so all of the barriers and the exploitative practices that either create poverty or keep people in poverty are not being talked about anytime that we're talking about charity and aid. And so I've described this as a way of kind of claiming the mind space, as a kind of sleight of hand maneuver that when we're talking about one thing, we're not simultaneously talking about the other. And because only one logic can be active in the mind of a person at any given time, that what we're doing is reinforcing the narrative in people's minds, but also we're failing to reinforce or even bring up other narratives that we think are more essential for dealing with poverty. So that's kind of, in general, the critique of the aid narrative and why we think it's so important to minimize or reduce the amount that we're talking about it as much as possible. Now, what we really have come to in our research as a big takeaway is that there is an alternative. And this alternative is a general approach. So it's not that there's a simple recipe, but that if we're not talking about aid and charity, first of all, this doesn't mean that we don't promote or use aid in any way. It's more that the structure of the conversation should not make it the primary emphasis, but rather that there are other things we could be talking about that would be more emotionally evocative, more concrete in terms of empowering and meaningful action for participants, and very importantly, as we'll come to in just a moment, that don't alienate our base, that don't alienate the very people that we want to work with to achieve the changes in the world that we're trying to make. So first of all, this is a kind of a review in a sense that in our research over the last few years, we've consistently observed that the way that most NGOs talk about poverty continues to passively describe poverty as a thing in the world. So they'll say things like, poverty rose by 10%, or more people are in poverty now than used to be in poverty 5 years ago, and poverty is this background condition of the world. And what that does, talking about poverty in that passive way, is it obscures the creation story for poverty. So this is something that we really can't emphasize enough, that the more that we describe the way that poverty is actively created, the more that we are able to push back against this implicit assumption that poverty is just a natural part of the world, and also the more we're able to direct attention toward concrete actions that can lead to meaningful and substantive change. So in some other research that a colleague of ours has done, Anat Shankar-Osorio in Oakland, California, when she was looking at metaphors for inequality, is that we've discovered that there's a very specific metaphor for talking about poverty and inequality that is helpful for us, and that is the metaphor of creating obstacles or barriers to opportunity. So if there are barriers to getting out of poverty, that means that someone put barriers in place, or someone could remove barriers. And so the people who are in an impoverished condition can remove the barriers themselves, or people who have been actively putting the barriers in place can be stopped from doing so. And now when we start to try to talk about poverty in this way that focuses on creation stories, active engagement and basically human beings doing things that are creating poverty, then we're able to tell very different kinds of stories. And in the slide that we have up now, I wrote a brief bit of text just to give an example of how we could tell this kind of a story. So this example says, a global system of corruption is used to exploit workers and hoard money and power. So you can see right away that we're talking about structures and obstacles that are in place, and that they've been put in place intentionally by people to do things, to exploit workers and to hoard money and power. Now the second sentence is saying the richest people, so this is like the Occupy Wall Street 99% versus 1%. So the richest people or the wealthiest or the elites routinely use tax havens to steal the wealth while billions of people struggle to make ends meet and countless millions die trying. The wall of secrecy surrounding global corruption is an obstacle that we can dismantle together and create a more just and sustainable world. So here we're describing tax havens as being an obstacle or barrier that could be dismantled. So if we tell stories like this, and we're not saying this is the only story to tell, but if we tell stories of this nature that are framed around this perspective, you can see how much concreteness there is about human agency, about political motives and agendas, about ideology, where this is describing an ideology of basically neo-realism and neoconservatism, of particular ways of thinking about power and politics, and that the actions become much more meaningful than something like signing a petition or giving a little bit more money to an organization. They're about working together to dismantle structures of power in this case, the global system of tax havens.
Yeah,
So,
cool. Can you say just a little bit of this from a very, very kind of clearly cognitive perspective? Why having a beginning, middle, and end works better from a cognitive perspective than just a give it a little bit more money?
yeah, it's actually a really important point that the way that the human brain is wired and the way that our minds work is fundamentally grounded in how profoundly social and moral human beings are. So there are parts of our brains that are wired to activate emotions, especially about the moral judgments of behaviors of other people. So this is where, you know, people routinely engage in spreading gossip and rumors, and it turns out from an evolutionary perspective, it's a very good thing that we do this. We're constantly, you know, people are constantly attracted to talking about the good deeds or the bad behaviors of other people. And so if we fail to tell stories that activate this immoral and emotional sensibility about the good behaviors or the bad behaviors of other people, then we're missing out on the most powerful motivators of social behavior. So said on the flip side of that, if we tell stories about the moral transgressions of other people, so we either say these other people are doing bad things or these people are doing good things, that we're activating those same emotions that drive social sharing behavior. So if we want to create campaigns that engage people, that either provoke and activate our opposition to more radical and extreme places, which helps them marginalize themselves, or if we want to activate our own base, those people who share our values and share our agenda, then the more that we can talk about these stories in a way that activates people's moral judgments about social behavior of other people, then the more we'll be able to do this. So this is another one of these kinds of stories.
Yeah, let me just add one point in there as well. Right now, it seems, certainly in the UK, I'm less familiar with research from across Europe, but it's certainly true in America and the UK, and research that I've seen from Australia, is that the idea of the agency in this story is largely captured already. The idea of the feckless poor, the helpless poor, the poor being it's their own fault, the undeserving poor, this a narrative we all know very well, that is dominant. So unless we provide a different story that has different agents at work and places the agency in a different place, that story will continue to dominate. So that's how we should see this. This is the alternative to that story. And the charity and aid story feeds into, if anything, the idea of the helpless, undeserving poor. They are people that need saving. They are people, as Charles Kenny once put it, we must help because they are helpless, sort of logic. Right, sorry, Joe, I interrupted you there. Let me go straight on for the next slide. Off you go.
No, those are wonderful, very important points, especially the point that telling the aid story actually does active harm to our cause. And so it's not simply that telling the aid story is keeping us from telling other more powerful stories. It actually, sometimes in indirect ways and sometimes in direct ways, is complicit in falling into that larger narrative and reinforcing it. And so it's problematic in that way as well. So when we tell these other stories, this alternative approach, there are things that we can start to kind of make note of as practical considerations to help us do this better. And so one thing is that if we make the assumption that we are the smart guys, we're the ones who have done the research and we know what we're talking about, and the reason that the public does not share our concerns is because they're uninformed or stupid. If we make those kinds of assumptions, then first of all, we're being kind of arrogant, or we could be very arrogant in some cases, and we're acting as if we're better when we take that position. And this is inherently patronizing. And one thing that we've learned from some research that was conducted here in the U.S. By the Center for Community Change, led by Anat Shanker-Osorio, was that when they looked at the language that people in the U.S. were using to talk about poverty and inequality, saying, so words and phrases like the poor the working poor, the lower class, these kinds of terms. They found that when they went and actually listened to the way that people in that economic class talked about themselves, that those people did not use these words. That the people who are in the lowest, say, 10% bracket of income in the US do not call themselves the poor. They call themselves hardworking Americans. They talk about how they are trying to make ends meet, how they're trying to be good parents and trying to be good employees, trying to be good co-workers, trying to be good community members. But they're not the poor. They don't talk about themselves in that way. Almost no one does, actually. There's a big social stigma around being poor. It's treated as a negative thing, so people don't self-identify into it. So what that means is that when we use language that evokes that stigma, we're actually alienating ourselves from our base, because we're using language that they actively distance themselves from. And so this actually leads to another recommendation, which is that if we do robust cultural research, and I'm not just talking about frame analysis, although that's been an important emphasis of my contribution to this whole dialogue. It's not simply about frame analysis. It's about doing broad cultural listening in ways that help us to actually understand how other people that we want to engage with, how those people think and talk. So rather than telling a story that creates an us versus them kind of dichotomy, which just puts another barrier into the effort by taking the people that we want to help and treating them as if they're different from us, and then using language that distances them from us, we can actually go in the opposite direction. We can go and listen closely to how those people think and talk about themselves and the issues and how they express their values. And then we can look for the places where our values align with their values, where their concerns align with ours, and then we create a shared language together. So if we do this, one thing that happens automatically is there's no longer this separation of agency, where we and the NGOs running the campaign are the ones taking action that we want other people to support. So we're like the locus of agency and power, control, action, and so on. But that actually all affected groups, the NGOs and the communities they're seeking to serve, can come together and share agency. So this is where we can talk about breaking down those barriers that keep people in poverty or that keep things unequal. That breaking down these barriers is something that we can all do together, and we're forming a shared in-group. But to do this, we have to talk about what we share in common. So this is where the language needs to be very concrete. It needs to be something that is relevant to the daily lives of people and the way that they talk about issues. So if the people in the lower economic class are talking about the difficulty they have caring for a sick relative, or the troubles they have raising their children and having enough money to send them to college, put them in school, give them enough food or keep shelter over their heads, paying their bills, whatever it may be, these very concrete concerns, that if we go and listen actively using well-designed surveys, focus groups, tracking text and conversations on social media, as well as doing frame analysis, that if we do these things well, we'll actually hear how these people are talking about things, and then we can look directly at the economic hardships they're facing in their lives and tell authentic stories that are relevant and empowering to those people. And so if we do this, this is only going to make our campaigns more effective. It's only going to build stronger connections, stronger relationships with the members of our community, which means that they'll be more engaged and more committed to helping our organizations survive, which is going to be helpful for us in the long run for fundraising issues, keeping our organizations up and running. And so this is why we think this is not only stronger in that it moves away from the aid and charity narrative, but also stronger because it's actually more effective, and it's increasingly proven among those groups that are using these communication guidelines. It's more effective at campaigns, getting participation and achieving campaign goals.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Just to remind people, there's a Q&A box. If you do have any questions or any just thoughts you want to share with people, please do put your thoughts and questions in there. We've got quite a nice group of people participating right now. So that would be very, very helpful. One more final thing to say about this. We drew attention to this particular research that only came out last week from the US for two reasons. One is I'm not saying that, that frames are to a degree culturally specific, but there are commonalities across cultures and across countries too. And we pulled these particular ones out because these are the same. We have found almost exactly these same these same conclusions and recommendations in other research that we've seen from around the world as well. So these seem to be these did come out of the US, and they should be taken always as these are particularly for the US. But there is a relevance to these for all of us, and these are echoed in other research from around the world. Important to say, Joe, we're just going to go on to the next slide about the particular language. Important to say before we do that, not to confuse language with frames, or messages with frames. Messages are the very, very top, like the 10% of the iceberg that's above the water. Frames are the 9/10 of the iceberg below the water, the logic upon which messages are built. And there's people very common conflation that people will think messages and frames or language and frames are exactly the same. They are very closely related, but they are not the same thing. So what we're going to talk about quickly now is some of the language that activates, again from this US research, that we found in common with other research from around the world, language that activates the more powerful frames. Off you go, Joe.
Yeah, so basically, you can think about this as these are words and phrases that evoke sensibilities and conceptual models. And by conceptual model, what I mean is the way that a person has a conceptual understanding. And so a great example of this from science education is the question, how does the year work? How do the seasons work? And there's a question of whether the Earth is rotating around the sun, or whether the sun is rotating around the Earth. These different ways of conceptualizing that relationship. And each one of those is a semantic frame or a mental model for how the Earth and the sun relate to each other to create the seasons. So in the same way, these words and phrases evoke deeper conceptual understandings. And just as every science teacher knows, a person can have a conceptual understanding and that concept can be incorrect. A person can have a misconception. And so addressing misconceptions and changing language is exactly the same process as learning a new concept, in the way that a teacher who's, say, teaching about planetary motion in a science class would be going through a learning process with whoever is learning the concept. And so in the same way as we're talking about which words to use and what their implications may be, this is not simply about change the words and everything else will follow, but really an active process of grappling with the ways that we think about things and the assumptions that come up with the ways that we think about things, and then really validating and casting out the assumptions that are either right or wrong. And so when we talk about words to avoid and words to embrace, we're really saying that there are logic and there are sensibilities that shape human behavior when we use one set of words or another, and that what we want to be very careful about is understanding the cause and effect relationships between the ways that we as campaigners or communicators are thinking about issues, and how that leads to the language that we use, and then how that language is received by the public, and especially how that language relates to the other stories that are out there in the culture. So part of the reason to avoid some of these words is that they activate stories out in the culture that we don't want to activate because they undermine our efforts. And other ones we don't want to use because they directly alienate, marginalize, or put down people that we really don't intend to alienate, marginalize, or put down. So on the words to avoid side, we already have poor, low income. So these are words that, as we were talking about earlier, they alienate people. They have stigmatized, negative sensibilities around them. So the people that we would want to talk to would not relate to them. So instead of saying words like that, we could say something like people who can't make ends meet, or people who are living on the brink. And it turns out that looking at focus group studies in the US, that people that are in an impoverished place, they could relate to this because in both of those phrases, saying that you can't make ends meet or that you're living on the brink, both cases it's focusing on an active struggle. So the impoverished person is not passively in a place of suffering. They're actively working to improve their condition, but there are barriers that are getting in their way. So if they can't make ends meet, that means that they are trying very hard to make enough money, but something is getting in the way. It might be that their wages are too low. It might be that there aren't enough employment opportunities. It might be that they routinely get sick and aren't able to go to work enough, so they don't earn enough money. But whatever the case may be, when they can't make ends meet, that is framed semantically, that is presenting a situation where a person is actively struggling against a barrier. Same thing with living on the brink. If someone is living on the brink, what that does is that suggests that a person is near the edge of collapse. They're near a place where they could fall over the edge. And they are living on the brink, which means something is pushing them toward the edge. And they're pushing back against it to try to keep from falling over. So again, this phrase is having the person who is in the impoverished place be in active struggle. And so this emphasis on active and agent, the person is actually doing things, is extremely important because that's an empowering position. So another word to avoid was safety net. And think about the safety net is something that catches you if you fall. So basically, you don't have to do anything. It's just passively there. Whereas if we talk about basic living standards, that's saying that people are going about their daily lives. But if we have standards, I mean, think about the word standards in a kind of everyday sense of how people use it. If I say, I'm lowering my standards, what that means is that I am no longer applying the same level of expectation for the quality of an outcome. So basic living standards is saying that live up to our standards, which is, again, an active role for people. So if there are basic living standards put in place, that means that our representatives, the people who are creating our policies for us, our economic policies, they are living up to the ethical standards that we would expect of them in a representative democracy. But also that people who are struggling to make ends meet are able to rise up to the basic living standards, which means that they're morally good people who are achieving their goals. They're working hard, but it's working for them. So in both directions, looking at the people that are accountable for the policies and for the people who are kind of holding themselves accountable to trying to make ends meet and trying to make things work, then in both cases they're actively trying to live up to standards.
Got a good question here, Joe, as things come in. Would these kinds of words work at a global level, or are they culturally specific?
I would say that we really need to treat these specific words as culturally specific. They're coming out of focus group studies in the United States. And so it may be that living on the brink or making ends meet is not the way that people talk about things in other cultures where they have different metaphors for their daily struggles. I think the more important lesson for us to take here is twofold. There are 2 points. One point is that there is a language that everyday people use, and wherever you're doing your campaign work, it's very important to know what that language is. So in the US, this is what should be done. If you're doing this work in Bangladesh, if you're doing this work in South Africa, then you need to know what the local language is. But the other point is that each of these phrases is using our understanding of those underlying metaphors of barriers, agency, active struggle, empowerment. So those themes are coming up. So I would say that any person who's developing messaging for their campaigns can use these as like a checklist. When I talk about poverty and inequality, is it a barrier or is it something else? When I talk about this issue, is the person that I'm talking about passive or active? Am I using language that relates to how this person talks about things, or am I using language that this person doesn't relate to? These are like check marks that we could use for good communication. So I think that it's very important that there are cultural differences, and we need to know those. But at the same time, I think there are underlying design criteria that I think we could generally use and trust to work.
That's a nice word, underlying design criteria. I like that. Can you say particularly, to kind of skip down to the, bring out the we and the you and I, and then the fight poverty, war on poverty, casualties of poverty, because that last one is very, very, using that sort of fighting language and fighting metaphors is very, very common, and it's something we are all pretty comfortable with, and we have a long history of doing. Can you just talk a little bit about what were the problems with doing that?
Yeah, there are two things that are really big problems with the framing of war. So one thing about the framing of war is that war is scary, and war has enemies. War creates a sense of different groups competing with each other. So there are inside groups and outside groups. And so if we talk about fighting poverty, just think about the construction of that for a second. If poverty is the enemy and we're at war, then the enemy is going to have foot soldiers. Who are the soldiers of the enemy? Well, if poverty is the enemy, then the soldiers of the enemy are the people who are in poverty, the people who are making poverty evident to us. So basically what that's doing is that is treating the impoverished people as though they're part of the problem. And while we may not intend for that to happen, that's one of the things that happens. Another thing that is problematic about this, and I think is a really profound weakness of it, is that when we talk about war or we talk about any kind of intergroup conflict, there's this psychological phenomenon. It's called infrahumanization. And basically, infra means less than. So infrahumanization is when you treat someone like they're less than human. So if the group that we are not a part of, that we're opposed to and fighting against, is less than human, then what that means is that we have less empathy for them. So the whole construct of war reduces empathy. It increases solidarity for our own side, but that's not the same as having empathy. So we see this all the time with the conversations about supporting our troops, which is a really big thing here in the US. We talk about supporting our troops. What that actually does is it reduces our ability to have empathy and compassion for our troops. Because we're sending our troops off to war, which means we can't care about them too much. We can't be too emotionally connected with them if they're going to go and fight and die, because that's going to be traumatizing to us. And when they come back from war, we're not talking about the post-traumatic stress syndrome and the mental illness and the physical ailments. And we can basically ignore all of the sick people who are the returned veterans. So actually talking about war reduces empathy even for our own side. But it also reduces empathy for whoever we're framing as the opponent. So
great.
This is a really big weakness.
Good question here. Thank you, Joe. So we've got the word charity has a value of altruism and good deed attached to it. How do we say no to it without making ourselves look selfish?
That's a great question. You know, one of the things about charity is that charity, like a lot of other value-laden concepts, is what linguists would call an essentially contested concept. Essentially contested concepts are any idea that can have very different meanings depending on which values are evoked. So freedom is a really powerful example of this, because you can have freedom to do something or freedom from something, and depending on what kind of freedom you're talking about, you can end up with contradictory outcomes. And so charity has some of that ambiguity built into it as a concept. It can be inherently good. To be a charitable person is to be someone who is generous and giving and altruistic. So you can see there that charitable is something that means generosity. But you can also say that being charitable is kind of condescending, like saying, well, that was a charitable thing to say, meaning that you really are giving me ground in the conversation that I couldn't have had myself, because I was the marginalized person, and it's got this kind of condescension built into it. So you can see how, depending on which ethical dimension of the concept is being communicated, it can mean very different things. So this question of whether talking about charity can lead to self-interest or selfishness, this is something that has been talked about quite a lot in the work of the UK-based group Common Cause, where they've been looking at social values and whether those social values align with extrinsic or intrinsic motivation. So talking about charitable giving, unfortunately, one thing about charitable giving is that the larger discourse, the global conversation about value, has become so dominantly about money that if we talk about charity, it's going to very easily mean the exchange of money. someone has money and they give someone else money. Now, of course, there are many ways to be charitable, and there are many things that can be given or received that are not about money. But because so much emphasis of the global discourse, especially about the economy, is about financial terms and money, that the charitable giving frame will tend to activate a sense of money changing hands. This is definitely true where charitable giving is about aid, where aid is money from one government to another, than it is specifically about money. Well, the reason that money is important is that other psychological research has been done that has shown that when we talk about money, when we prime someone to think in terms of money, that tends to activate a mindset of scarcity, where if there's money, there's not enough money. And so one thing that automatically comes up in a lot of people's minds psychologically is, do I have enough money? Which becomes an issue of a kind of a self-directed focus or a selfishness, a self-interestedness. And so the various psychological studies that have looked at the priming of money have found that anytime that you mention money, people will tend to become less altruistic, less empathetic, less cooperative, and more antisocial. This is a general tendency. So when we talk about charitable giving in a way that it becomes associated, even if it's not intended to, if it becomes associated with the exchange of money, then it will tend to activate extrinsic motivation and selfish or self-interested tendencies, which will simultaneously, and this is where the work of common cause comes in. When we talk about when we activate an extrinsic motivation, the parts of our brains that would be focused on intrinsic motivation will be suppressed, and vice versa. So it actually has this tendency to reinforce self-interest and reduce community or cooperative values.
Good. Okay, we've got a couple of good questions coming in. One here from Claire that seems very popular. In the context of using language people use to describe themselves, what is your advice for communicating about one culture? Excuse me, there's a bit of noise coming out my window. Communicating about one culture to another. For example, developing country to the UK. The language from Zambians, for example, might not be clear to a UK audience. How do you speak cross-culturally?
I think that we can look at the cross-culture facilitators around the world. You know, there are a lot of people whose job is to negotiate and facilitate discussions across cultures, and they've learned a lot of things over the years. But one of the things that I think we can apply directly to this question, which is a really, really important question, is that to communicate across cultural boundaries, there has to be empathy and listening, and I mean active listening, going on in both directions. So if there is not active listening in both directions, then the communication is likely to lead to some kind of conflict or misunderstanding. And a classic example of this would be if two people from different cultures tried to date each other. So here I am, an American. Let's say that I started dating someone who's from Namibia. I would very quickly run into conflicts in my relationship where I would say something that had very different meanings or connotations in the other culture. And if my partner and I did not actively listen to each other, if we didn't have a shared foundation in our relationship of trying to learn about each other's culture, then the relationship would very likely lead to failure. And I think that that is generally going to be true at the level of campaigns. So the challenge here is to cultivate a mutual interest on both sides to learn about each other's culture. So if someone's in a UK context and they're trying to bring a message from another country to the UK, they actually need to do cultural research in both places. How do people think about it and talk about it in the UK and in the other country? And then they need to actively build bridges. And one thing that can help with this is specifically saying that they're trying to build bridges, trying to make clear in the way that they construct the context or the situation where the conversation happens that one of the goals is to understand the people who have a different point of view.
Yeah, and good, thank you.
Would you add more to that?
I also wanted to ask Jerry, who doesn't seem to be enjoying this conversation. Jerry, can you elaborate a little bit on what your point was? I have to ask if there is any point to this conversation. It'd be good to know a little bit more about what you're thinking there. Would like to be able to address any kind of confusion about that you have. Another question here from Mary. Regarding language, where would you position government and governing structures?
Government and governing structures is all about authority and power. And so the really important question is whether power is something that is constructed in a way that people feel is helpful to them or is oppressive to them. And so when we talk about government and we talk about governing, one of the key questions is going to be whether people feel like they have a voice, whether they feel like they are helping to make a decision happen, or whether the decision is happening to them. And so if the general sense that people have, if the everyday experience that people have is a disconnect between an elite group of people that are making decisions and where the outcomes seem to be serving that elite, and the everyday people feel like even if they vote and they try to participate, that their voice isn't heard, then their relationship to government is going to be inherently suspicious because they don't feel like they have shared power, or they don't feel like they have the ability to contribute in a meaningful way or have their voice heard. So this is a very fundamental issue. And I think that we can look at this in the context of, to really try to make it comprehensible to us, think about how decisions are made in our own homes. So if I lived in a house, like let's say that I'm 17 years old, so I'm still at home, I'm still a teenager, I have some ability to make decisions. My parents may have let me get a part-time job, and I can go in and hang out with my friends and do whatever I want on weekends, but I have to be home by a certain time, like I have a curfew. So these are normal things that a teenager would negotiate with parents. So one of the questions would be whether the parents are sharing that decision-making with me. Do I get to help create the rules for how my curfew is enforced? Or do they just impose it on me, and I have no say in the matter? Because if my parents say, you have to be home by 10 o'clock, I don't care what you say, you better be here or you're going to be grounded, you're going to be in trouble, then I might decide to rebel and actually stay out past curfew just to show my parents that I can actually take power and make my own decisions. So see how the orientation to whether or not I have the ability to share power or whether power is imposed upon me is going to influence my behavior, and whether I feel like the authority, the people who are making the decisions, the people who are doing the governing, whether I feel like they are legitimate or not. And so when we talk about government and governing, this is a core sensibility that we really need to be conscious in bringing out. How do people feel about it now, and what are the ways that it can be improved? When they do feel badly, like people don't trust their government, do they have legitimate concerns? Because if we ignore those legitimate concerns, we'll just show ourselves to be out of touch. And so I think that's a really fundamental piece of that.
Thank you, Joe. I must say we did some research a while back when I was at Oxfam that showed we were looking for correlations between public opinion and decisions by the government on ODA and aid, and there was actually no statistical correlation between what the public thought and what the only correlation we could find was whether people trusted in the government generally or whether they didn't. And the more people trust in government generally, the more they'll support aid. So it's interesting that people don't have people's relationship to their understanding of structures of power very wide impact across what they will support or not. I think the main point that I would say to this is that there must always be, as we were talking earlier about the creation story, there always needs to be active agency at play, creating the barriers that keep people in poverty. So activating ideas of government and power or corporations or elites is very, very important. If we don't do that, the default will be people blame people in poverty themselves. So if you don't mention the power structures that created, that's where they'll automatically rest. There was another question here from Devi. Joe, what happens when you're using a gender lens to talk about the poverty creation story and the barriers to overcome? What words would you embrace or avoid?
This is a really, really important issue because the way that gender has been constructed we could generally say the last 8,000 to 10,000 years, where for the most part, there have been patriarchal societies, and I'm really talking about the civilizations here, not the hunter-gatherer societies, but the civilizations of the world for the last 8,000 years have almost entirely been oppressive against women. And so the the deep-seated power imbalance that is shaping the way that girls and women have been treated for thousands of years is something that we're actively grappling with in the entire discourse around inequality. Because when we talk about wealth inequality or economic inequality, we're really talking about how privilege and how the lack of privilege are distributed across the society. And that is deeply intertwined with gender issues. There are plenty of ways that male privilege keeps women in underprivileged places, whether it's lower wages or lack of access to education or any of a number of other things. So when we look at this through the gender lens, I think that, first of all of the critiques of the structures of power become it's not even that they become just as valid, they actually become even more valid. I think it further validates the need for us to make those critiques of power. So one thing that I think is really a powerful opportunity for us is the way that the empowerment of women as a general topic has been growing in significance. There are more and more groups that recognize the importance of the empowerment of women, and there are more and more groups that are taking the feminist literature that has, for decades now, looked at the ways that conversations about women marginalize women. So if I talk about the empowerment of women as a man in a privileged position from the West, I have to be very careful that I'm not reinforcing my own privilege and I'm not reinforcing the marginalization of women in the way that I talk about it. And so in the same way that we'd said that the aid and charity discourse do this in general, and the language of the poor and the working poor marginalize the people who are in a situation of struggle, I think the same thing can be said that when we talk about the role of gender in this, the active struggle is a really important point of emphasis. So when we look at the women and girls who are in active struggle to improve their lot in life, the women and girls who are actively trying to build careers for themselves, actively trying to create more opportunities for themselves, for their families, for their children, etc., that the agency and the focus on the barriers is, again, going to be very important.
Thank you.
I'd say that the language, the recommendations are basically the same in terms of everything we've talked about so far today.
Great. We're going to have to start to round up. We've only got a few minutes left. I'm going to answer one question here from Elise. How do you see transforming this discourse delivering in terms of changing the global system at the top to deliver real change above and beyond aid and development? That's the killer question. That's the, does it basically, I read that as saying, does it, if we do all this, is it going to actually deliver any change? I think my response to that would be, right now that we know that the current dominant frames and discourse around charity and aid particularly are active blockers to commensurate to the sorts of change that we all know we need to see if we're going to really address these things. So we know that there is an active barrier in place right now. There is no way to empirically prove, it's just impossible to do, there's no way to empirically prove that changing this bit of this discourse will result in this bit of practical change. That doesn't actually make sense as a formulation of how we can prove change will happen. But we do know from all the evidence that we've gathered from across multiple fields that it is almost impossible to happen. Commensurate change is impossible to happen as long as the current frames exist. So this comes back to the point of what is the most powerful condition within which change is likely to happen. And right now, with the charity and aid as dominant, that is not a powerful, the right conditions within which we will see change. So if we want to see change, we have to change the discourse. Whether this is there's a direct line you can draw in kind of linear causal sense between changing this discourse and this change is probably well, it is a futile effort to try and think about things in that way. Joe, I'm going to move on to the last slide. We've got 3 minutes left. Any quick word you want to say on that bit?
Yeah, I mean, I would say this, that underlying this entire conversation is a basic observation I've made. And so, briefly about my background, I was trained in physics and mathematics, and I did research as an atmospheric scientist for a few years before transitioning over to cognitive science. And so I spent a lot of time working actively in scientific communities. And one of the things that I've noticed since I've gotten into the campaigning and activism world is how little actual science is done. And the very specific point that I think is most helpful for us to figure out how to structurally change these systems is one piece of science that I think is missing right now. See, in science is actually something that's done by a community of people that check each other's assumptions. So if there's a researcher who's doing some work and someone else takes their work and either uses it incorrectly, misrepresents it, or does some other work that claims something different but doesn't have a very effective methodology, that other members of the community will come and call that out and say that it's not correct, and say and describe what is correct and what is working and what's generally been kind of vetted and shown to be effective or legitimate knowledge by the community. And over time, the scientific community will correct its faulty assumptions, and the knowledge will improve over time. What I've found is that in campaigning, this, for the most part, does not happen. There's a lot of very good research out there that is being developed, but we're generally speaking not using it. And we're certainly not using it systematically across all of our campaigns to determine what the best ways are to run our campaigns. And so there's a lot of opportunity for us to improve, a great deal of opportunity to improve.
Great.
And
okay, sorry, Joe, we're just coming right to the end. Thank you, Elise. I'm glad we got to answer that question. Jerry, sorry we haven't been able to understand your concerns a bit more, but I hope this has proved useful for some people. In the letter that we sent to all the NGOs and everything, we did say one of the recommendations was, to Joe's last point, that there's an enormous amount of research and evidence out there that is sitting, gathering dust on the shelves and not really being used an awful lot. And we suggested that they start to hire experts like cognitive linguists, anthropologists, systems theorists, people who can bring this very exciting new research and analysis to bear on our campaigning to make them more powerful. We know that lots of people don't have the resources; they can just pick up and go and hire people. So in the meantime, we want to do what we can to help people. So if there is anything we can do to help, please do ask. We've spent a lot of time in this space doing the research, studying it. We spend a lot of time still going out and gathering and reading research. So we're relatively well informed and up to date. So those are just three things we thought we might be able to offer people. If you have specific ideas you want to fire to us, or you want to just ask for have a conversation with us, just to act as a sounding board, we'll always try to make time for that. We can share research that we come across, anything like that, just to help people move things along. If all this, because this can sometimes feel quite daunting, and we know people don't have the expertise and sometimes the time just to be able to find other experts. So we've got a little email address there, narrativechat@therules.org. We will track that email inbox, and we hope that please do feel free to call on us if you think there's anything we can do.